Well, welcome everyone to this webinar that features author David Hicks and myself, Christopher Perrin. We're going to have a conversation about his forthcoming book, The Stones Cry Out. If I can get the camera to focus on it. Let's see. Let me try doing this. There you go. Now you're reading it backwards, but you can still see that it says The Stones Cry Out. David's been working on this book, not just for the last year, but really, as you'll say in a bit, for a lifetime. David keeps commonplace books, which I recommend as a practice, just writing down things that you're thinking about based on your reading and observations. And he describes writing this book by collecting and gathering ideas and thoughts from a lifetime of reading. So this has kind of grown over a period of time. And he uses the metaphor of building a wall as a kind of controlling metaphor for the entire book. So David, if I could just turn to you and ask you to maybe give us a bit of your narrative. You're well known in classical Christian education circles as the author of Norms and Nobility. That book on a treatise on education has had surprising, you would say, surprising influence over the years. You wrote that as a research project, as a young educator, studying the classical tradition, writing this, and it's been read by so many in the last 30 years or so who are part of this renewal. So you're known for doing that, and you're also known because you and your brother did a great translation of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, published first as the Emperor's Handbook, just as Stoicism is kind of getting interesting again in our culture, and it's just sold like crazy. I teach it in a course that I teach with a college program. But could you fill in the gaps? I just wanted our readers or viewers to know that about you, but tell us a little bit about your journey. And as you're telling that narrative, maybe you could build up to how this book came about.
Well, fortunately, Chris, God is in the gaps, and I can't fill that in. But you did, I think, a good job of describing sort of how the book came about. I do keep this commonplace. I think I've got 9 of them now, books, just to record sort of things I'm thinking about. And what was interesting to me is 3 or 4 years ago, I was looking over my commonplace books. I actually hadn't reread them ever, really. And I sat down, part of what you do in your retirement, I sat down and sort of reread my commonplace books and said, where was my intellectual life, such as it is, where was it going? And then I did, I think, what in science they called sort of an induction. I started to recognize some kind of themes and things I was writing about over a number of years. And I had the sudden inspiration to say, I can organize these themes in terms of myths that we subscribe to. And it is really the core idea and inspiration of the book. Is I basically came to the conclusion, reading my commonplace book, that all of our lives are governed by either religious myths. Well, religious myths or secular myths. The religious myths, which really prevailed in the West, were the primordial myths of Genesis, those first 3 myths that are so powerful. And then beyond that, the secular myths of what I call myths of reason, which is philosophy, myths of science. And more recently, in terms of a myth, sort of articulated, is what I call the myth of the imagined self. And what I've tried to do in the book is weigh the 3 primordial myths against the 3 secular myths and talk about the differences in these myths and how they play out in our lives and play out in society. And I start the whole book by responding to a question I'm sort of putting out there to my reader is, why would a well-educated, seemingly intelligent guy choose these marvelous primordial myths over these flawed modern myths. And I'm using marvelous in the sense of amazing. I mean, or extraordinary outside of our normal experience. I mean, to give you a simple example, I mean, the idea of God being born of a virgin as a baby and coming into the world, that's mind-boggling. That's just impossible for a reasonable person to say, oh yeah, that's not a problem. It's marvelous. What's less understood in our time, I think, is how profoundly flawed the secular myths are. And what I'm trying to point out in this book is some of those flaws that the secular myths are never going to overcome, some of these flaws that make them, even in their own on their own terms or in terms of our life experience, ridiculous. But we live with them just the same. And I think, sort of giving away the punchline of the book, but where the book ends up saying, so many of our contemporaries are trapped between these two ideas. Do I choose these marvelous myths or these flawed myths? And the default position appears to be, well, I'm just going to go with the myth of the imagined self. I'm just going to pretend I'm God, invent myself, reinvent myself, and make sure that the television is always turned on, the music is always turned up. So that's, in a nutshell, the book. But because it comes out of a commonplace book, because of two things I say about it. One is, I think it will appeal to a reader because it's not a long, systematic argument over something which can be really boring and very difficult for the modern life. You know, we don't sit down and read 400-page books involved with a systematic argument, although they're still written. We tend to read in bursts. You know, we pick up something, we read a little bit of it. That's one of the reasons I think our translation of Marcus Aurelius has become so popular, because that was basically Marcus. You can sit down, open up the book anywhere, read a page or two, and walk away thinking, wow, that was stimulating, that was interesting, that was challenging, I learned something. I hope this book would be the same, that you can almost let the pages fall open and read something that would be interesting and stimulating. And also, what the book is really about is what is real. What is real? And I think if we're really going to be, and I make this point several times in the book, if we're really going to try to come to grips with what is real, we're dealing with a plate of spaghetti. I mean, it's just tons of strands. It's tons of, it's a plate full of wet noodles. And if anyone we pick up, this is, I think the naturalist John Muir said that, anytime you pick up anything in nature, you find that it's connected with everything else. I mean, nothing is disconnected. And that's how reality is. And when you pick up a strand of this, any aspect of it, you find out, wow, it's connected to this, it's art, it's science, it's what this Virginia farmer wrote in his text. It's everything. And I think that will come through very much in my book as when you're finished with it, you realize you have a plate of spaghetti with everything connected.
Yeah. Well, you reminded me, David, that when I was doing a first read with you, that I suggested the metaphor as, in addition to the stone wall of the woven tapestry, because I felt like that's what you were doing as well. You were weaving together a number of really important threads that often people see only in isolation. And you have been essentially weaving like Penelope at the loom, or you've been building this wall. So I of course want you to unpack that metaphor, because it's central to the whole book. So we're going to ask David to do that, and I'm also going to ask him to define myth for us, because his book is about mythic reality. And as you were saying kind of before the call, we use words today sometimes so ambiguously we don't know what we're saying to each other. So I'd like you to bring some clarity to what you mean when you talk about mythic reality.
Hmm.
But first, let's just pause and let people introduce themselves in the chat box. Okay, it's always fun to see who's who's showing up. So if you're know how to do this, if you've got your Zoom yellow belt, you can click on that the chat box, and you can see a few people just saying hello already. But let's just see who you are, your name, and where you're from. And if you want to say something else about yourself, like maybe what you teach or a favorite art or subject that you love to study, love to hear that. So name, where you're from, and some biographical fact about yourself. Right, we've got some folks from Maryland, Michigan, Texas, Minnesota, Ontario, Canada. It's nice to have an international on the call. Somebody from Montana. David knows and loves that state.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Just, I know it's somewhat artificial, but this makes me feel a little, close to you. It's just great to see your names. And look at, we have Rona Kernier from Perthshire, Scotland. And she's a doctor who's also a homeschooler. Thank you for joining us from Scotland. Lindsay from Amarillo, Texas.
Nice to see you, Tim.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. You'll also see that there is a Q&A box down there at the bottom of your screen. That's where you can record a question. So we're going to leave some time for your questions. So please feel free at any time to just insert a question. And at various moments, we might just take a look. Certainly, as we get about 45 minutes in, we will take a look at those questions and have David respond. Okay. So once again, thank you for joining us. David, could you talk about myth? Sometimes people use that word to describe something that's not true, and therefore should be, not taken seriously. But you take myths very seriously. Why do you do that? Help us understand what mythic reality is.
Oh, okay. In fact, in the book, I used an example taken from New York Times crossword puzzle. They ask, they give a clue for the word myth, and the clue they give is a story not to be believed. And that is the modern sort of view of what a myth is. But myth is actually from the Greek mythos. It's a very ancient word. It's been used for thousands of years. And mythos in the classical or ancient tradition is it is a story, but it's a story to be profoundly believed because of the commanding truths that it is putting forward. But it always involves a lot of symbolism, a lot of unrepeatable, extraordinary events that happen once upon a time. The classic myth for us as Western Christians is the myth of the Garden of Eden. And I hope I'm not going to offend someone when I say this, but what's extraordinary to me about that myth is that there are certain groups of Christians who read that myth as a literally true thing. There was a chatty serpent in a garden who was chatting up Eve one day, and she tempted her to pluck fruit off of a tree, which was the knowledge of good and evil. Well, honestly, a tree with the knowledge of good and evil, a chatty serpent, there couldn't be, in an ancient sense, there couldn't be more of a mythic language than that. And yet the irony of our modern times is that the non-believers who are trying to ridicule Christianity, they do the same thing that the so-called fundamentalists do. They take a literal interpretation of it and say, now, who ever heard of these things? But what I try to show in the book is that this is a really profound and amazing myth, full of fascinating possibilities. One of the possibilities that modern thinkers are constantly wrestling with is, where did consciousness come from? Where was the birth of consciousness? Where did it happen? Well, you can actually, and I'm not suggesting this is what the myth is about, but I'm saying you could read that myth as a story of the birth of consciousness. And I talk a little bit about that in the book and why that's so. So that's, and I think Chris, I think I actually a couple of times come back to this in the myth because I know it's going to be a hang up for a number of people to use this term. But for those of you who are hung up on my use of it in relation to the creation myth and the garden myth and the murder myth, well, you'll be comforted to know I'm talking about science as a myth, reason as a myth, and the imagined self as a myth. These are all in the way I think of myths. And by the way, I think the ancient world approached myths, where this word comes from. They are all appropriate uses of the word myth. And they're not stories not to be believed. On the contrary, they're stories to be profoundly believed and to be incorporated into your understanding of what is real.
Yeah. And just to get at that, what can be a choking point for some, the historicity, say, of Adam and Eve. You can hold to the historicity of Adam and Eve and still see this mythic truth coming through. In fact, that's usually what you do find. As people will say, I do believe there was a historic Adam and Eve, and yet there's something about that fall, something about what happened in that exchange that changed us, so that we have something called ancestral sin or original sin. Something, there is a fall. And it's hard, even if you take things literally, to understand what it is about the biting of the apple, et cetera, and that made that happen. I mean, following it kind of in some literal fashion, you're still engaging something that's mythological. It's kind of like, why? I'm thinking of the fairy tales. You know, if you bite this apple, terrible things will happen. Castles will fall. Why there's that connection is somewhat mysterious, but the fact that there are connections, it's real. At midnight, you're going to turn into a pumpkin. And it makes me think also of the Greek and Roman myths. Our colleague Louis Marcus wrote a book called Myth Made Fact, and he goes through the Greek and Roman myths and shows how they are communicating profound truths, even though, of course, no one believes that Icarus and Daedalus really did fly, and that Icarus flew too close to the sun and his wax wings melted and he fell. But everybody understands exactly what that myth communicates, which is beware of your own pride and listen to your wise elders.
To your point, Chris, there may have been an Icarus and a Daedalus. You know, they may be actually historical figures, but I don't know how much my listeners know about Orthodox Christianity, but for Orthodox Christianity, a lot of the issues that are important to the non-Orthodox Christians are not important to us. The issue of whether or not there was a historical Adam and Eve or not, it really doesn't matter to me. It doesn't have any effect whatsoever on my faith. They could have been real. They could be part of the myth makers. We thought it was Moses for most of history, way of depicting a change, a profound change that happened to man when God breathed into his face the breath of life, which, by the way, is what the priest does to us when we are baptized, because that is the moment when we are reborn in a completely new way, according to the Christian dogma. So that doesn't matter to me. And frankly, and this is going to offend some people, I don't care whether God created man like that, right? Or he created man over a long period of evolving development. It's irrelevant to me. Both of those things are extraordinarily impossible. And yet God did them, because God is an impossible God. He does the impossible. That's the whole point of God. And to try to lose friends to me over debating those things, what's the point? All that stuff is just beyond belief. It's just incredible. And if if it's comforting to think that there was an Adam and Eve, as there may have been, believe it, absolutely. If it's comforting to think that God just decided one day, I'm going to make me a man, and bang, made it a man, okay, believe it. I mean, the problem with that is you're going to have to fight a bit with scripture on that front, because there were at least humanids around for a long time. Remember when the son of Adam and Eve, Cain, decides he's going to live without God and goes off to the land of Nod. He goes off to where there are other humanids living and form cities. I mean, there's already a culture. Even Cain and Abel, they're not hunter-gatherers, they're farmers and herdsmen. I mean, wait. Historically, how did that happen? So
you've got mysteries any way you turn in this regard.
Exactly. If you get into that debate, you can't win it on any grounds that make any sense to me anyway. And by the way, The Stones Cry Out, very personal book. They're my reflections. They're not reflecting some absolute truth, and I want to be clear on that.
Yeah, so it's good maybe just to put a pin on that, but because it is a disputed question among Christians trying to work this out, and I'm sure that all of you are in some way been investigating that question. But so I knew it would come up, so it's just nice to put a pin in it. But that's not David's point in this book. It's not to argue for what against or for the literal interpretation of Genesis. It's to do something that's larger, and then often, in my view, is kind of missed because we lose the forest for the trees. And so this is the book about the forest. So it's a big picture book that reflects a life of David's own thinking and reflection. So let's go back to that. Tell us why you use the stone building metaphor, and how is it that stone building metaphor kind of brings together and gathers your thinking about what it means to live in this culture right now, according to what's true, according to mysterious reality, rather than its false analogies.
Well, probably the most honest answer to that, Chris, is because when we began our discussion some time ago, you were talking about the weaving metaphor, which works perfectly well, and there are other kinds of metaphors that might work perfectly well. But as I said then, stone building is what I do. It's what I know. So the metaphor was, it came out of years of building random rubble stone walls. And I thought, wow, this is really a picture of what reality is for me. And as you know, The Stones Cry Out is in 8 books. And the first book is just a book about that. I call it a stone builder's Bible. And I talk about the kind of small truths that come out for building a stone wall, the small truths that always come out of that experience for me. And so I enlarged upon that as a metaphor for what we've been talking about. I'll give you a simple example of that. I'm an amateur. I'm not even a very good. I had a competition with a friend of mine a number of years ago who's really a good stone builder. He's actually now owns a whole village in the Ardèche in south of France, which he's bought these stone houses one by one and rebuilt them. He came to visit, and it was a cold, wet, rainy, typical Montana, windy day. And we had these 2 stone walls that were falling down in front of the ranch. And so we decided we'd have a competition. He'd rebuild one, I'd rebuild the other, and we'd do it sort of like speed climbing, right? Speed building. My wall fell down about 3 or 4 months ago. We built these 8 years ago. His wall's still beautifully standing. So, but the thing about building a stone wall, when you start out, you gather your stones. I'm talking about a random rubble wall, not a mortar-based wall. When you gather your stones, they're all, especially where I live, all different shapes and sizes. They're basically most stones at the base of mountains are granite. And what you do is you start looking for, you want to find those stones that are most brick-like, nice square edges, nice faces, so they'll fit right in your wall. But as you're doing this, so you search through your pile to find those stones and put them in place. And that's sort of how an amateur begins a stone wall. But the reality is, if you see a really friend of mine who's a Mexican stonemason, he's just amazing. But he doesn't even look at the pile. He just reaches over, grabs the stone, and comes to hand. He's got a stone hammer in one hand, bang, puts it in the wall. He's just working like crazy. But you realize when you do that there is going to be a place for every single stone in your pile in that wall. And I just love the truth of that, because that is true for our church. It's also true for society. There is a place for everybody, even those ugly little stones that you think you can't do much. Will they find their beauty as rubble? Because a wall needs rubble. You need stuff inside that pulls the whole wall together. And which of course suggests Plato and his whole notion of justice, every person knowing his or her duty and doing it. I mean, that's what creates a just society. It isn't a package of laws where everybody has their rights and their rights are protected. That just creates a society at war with itself. And so and the first book, Some Builders, it's just full of the kind of homey, humble, kind of commonsensical truths about life that I discovered while learning how to build random rubble stone walls. And by the way, those same principles that I just talked about, I think that's a principle that holds true for life too. We tend to gloss over the small moments, the strange coincidences, the accidental happenings, those things, we just rush by them and we want to go for the big stuff. But the reality is that life is made up of, the person who's got the rich life is the person who sees those small things as something to be used, as something to be benefited from, or something to benefit others from. I mean, who grabs a hold of those moments and lives through them. And that's stone builder's wisdom. Anyway,
it's such a very rich, and you're right, it's a principle, as some of these kinds of large metaphors are principles for a number of things simultaneously, which reminds me again, and I don't want to go too wide here, but I think it's worth saying once more. You started by talking about reality being interconnected and having, therefore being complicated, and yet we perceive it as a harmony. And yet it's also astonishing to us because we can't understand, we don't know all the notes, you might say. And so it's, we're astonished. We also are aware of our ignorance, and we're aware that we're small and this cosmos is large, ordered beauty. Sir Ken Robinson was once asked, as it was reported to me at a talk he was giving by a student, who said, "Should we integrate educations, Sir Robinson?" And he said, "It already is. Everything is already integrated, but we disintegrate it."
Mm-hmm.
The way we go about doing education, thinking about things, and you get to this when you in your myth of science and reason, you talk about Cartesian dualism and the breaking apart of things into what everything is. The only thing we seem to be able to do right now is break things into their parts, and then we think we understand reality. So I'll just give you that as an entry point. But you start with 3 sacred myths. You do creation, garden, Cain and Abel, that come from the scriptures, and you see these as telling us something profoundly true about human experience and even the cosmos as a whole. And you take the first half of the book just helping your readers see that cosmic mythic reality is rooted in some serious ways to these 3 stories. And then you counter that by saying because people don't want those anymore for various reasons, one alternative that seems to have been created over time, especially since the Enlightenment, are these counter myths, you might call them, that are trying to provide the same kind of meaning that only comes from sacred myths. And that's the myth of science, reason, and the imagined self. That's your structure. And then you said you've been building a wall for all your life that's trying to help you to understand mythic reality as it is in this kind of clash with a counter, false reality. Could, with that as kind of an entry point, could you describe what it is you want your readers to know? What is it that you're, as they're seeing you build this wall, what is it you're hoping that will happen? What are you seeking to achieve for the reader?
Yeah, well, as you were describing that, Chris, it suddenly occurred to me, and this hadn't occurred to me before, which amazes me, is that what I really did in building this wall is relive my life. And what I want to give my reader is what I have, I lived for 76 years. And one of the things we talked about, of course, I've been a school man, teacher all my life. Scott and I have been translating Plutarch's Lives, and Plutarch was a teacher of young people. He was really, all of his lectures, all of his letters were really focused on young people, although they were given often to adults. And when I was writing this book, I was thinking of young people. Of course, being a teacher and headmaster, I was thinking of that, I'm sure, while I was doing all my commonplace books. And, I headed schools for over 30 years. And, but, those early myths, I was marinated in those early myths. My father was a pastor. My mother and father were just profoundly Christian people. My father rose every morning at 5 o'clock and prayed for an hour. I mean, he was a truly humble man who believed profoundly in God's love for himself, for his family, for everybody, and just lived that out in the way. He was an amazing example. And so that was my early life. Then I went on and received what was a very secular education. I mean, no one would deny that I received as good an education as one can receive nowadays, and entered a very secular world, of course, both as an educator and also in terms of, time in the Navy, time in politics, stuff like that. And then retired and came home out to the wilds of Montana and had a chance to reflect on it all. I mean, what a gift. I mean, very few people have had either that life or the opportunity to look back on it and say, what did that all mean? Why was it like that? In a sense, that's the structure of my book in a way. And by the way, it's the structure of Western history as well. We went through the period of, certainly the primordial myths were totally dominant for 1,500 years or more. Then, of course, the reason myth became very important, crept in. The myth of science, as you pointed out with the Enlightenment, that became very strong. And now I think we're really living the myth of the imagined self. Most people, that is their myth, whether they're aware of it or not. And by the way, in the book, what I try to do is unmask these myths. We've talked about this. I try always at some point to say, look, these are the components of the myth of reason. Bang, 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 bang. And I try to state them as nakedly as possible, so you can't hide behind them or pretend that's not the case. These are the points of the myth of science. And so what am I trying to do with the book? What I'm trying to do is kind of unmask all this stuff, because it becomes obscured in a lot of our arguments and debates. We've already mentioned one of those big debates. But also I'm thinking of young people, and I'm thinking of them, what I'm really, part of a real effort of the book is try to unmask the academy, the secular academy. It does a lot of wonderful things. It has made some amazing discoveries, observations, but it has also done a lot of damage, a lot of evil in the world. You can trace right back to the theoretical thinking or the materialist mindset of the secular university. And what I'm trying to do with young people who are headed off to these places, especially young people who have an incipient faith, is say, beware. You know, you are Pinocchio about to have companions who are the fox and the wolf. That's where you're going. And beware of what they're going to be offering you. Beware of what they're going to be saying, because behind what they're saying is a myth. It's a myth of reason, or a myth of science, or the myth of the imagined self. Those are their myths. And here are the problems with their myths. They're going to assume a materialist point of view. And then I get back to when I was talking about bulleting. Here's what the myth of reason is really all about. This is what lies behind it. Here's what really is the myth of science is really all about. You're stepping into a minefield when you walk into that environment. And I don't care where you go to university, who your professors are. I mean, if you're going to work in the social sciences, you're definitely going to enter a field that is dominated by the materialist mindset, dominated by theoretical thinking, where your professors are going to embrace their theories with the fervor of Anabaptists. They're going to believe in their theories. And what a theory does, what theoretical thinking does, is, of course, social scientists believe they're scientists. And so a theory is like a hypothesis. It's a point of view, it's an idea about how society works, how the human personality works, however. And what do? They do what a scientist does. They look for confirming evidence. What's the evidence that my theory is correct? The problem with that is you're putting a lens on, which is now narrowing everything down. It's reductionist, as we said before. It's chopping things down into little pieces so that we can find the confirming evidence. The motivation, the drive to find confirming evidence in theoretical thinking is very powerful. You know, very few social scientists, in the hard sciences, you're supposed to look for black swans, right? You're supposed to look for that piece of evidence that just doesn't conform to your hypothesis. You find very little of that, or I have found very little of that among social scientists. They get wedded to their psychological theory. They get wedded to their sociological theory. They get wedded to their architectural theory, for Pete's sake. I mean, read Jane Jacobs. I mean, they did devastating, the effect of theoretical thinking in architecture and urban planning on American cities was absolutely devastating, but they wouldn't let go of it. Even when they ended up destroying basically 200 urban areas in America, they still were wedded to it. We see the same thing in education. They became wholly enamored years ago with this concept of whole language. And throw out phonics. Phonics isn't perfect, but it was getting much better results than whole language has gotten. And to me, again, I have a point of view about this, but you know, whole language works really well with about 10% of the population, where children are bright, where they're coming from families that are full of books, they're reading all the time, and they're surrounded by language. Kids do pick up that approach to learning. They're a disaster for families that, quote, our society is all about helping the underprivileged, the minorities, the people who are learning it as a second language. Well, we really care about those. Nonsense, we don't care about those families. We're driving a theory that is really only good for us, because who are the people who are reading these theories? University professors who have bright children who are working with their kids. So yeah. Anyway,
thank you.
I'm on my hobby horse now, but these things have to be sort of exposed in order for young people when they go off to the university. I don't want to make them antipathetic, but I do want them to make them profoundly skeptical of everything the professor is saying. That will make them better students, including me if I'm the professor.
Yeah. You know, as you're speaking, David, I'm remembering that these thoughts are present quite piquantly, maybe in a more seminal form, in your early book, Norms and Nobility. where you realize then, still in your 20s, that to exclude immaterial reality was to only be half a person. And so you argued for that even then, that materialism is a point of view and it leads to what you're going to see and not see. And you're also reminding me of what Einstein said, that 1,000 examples don't prove you right, but one example can prove you wrong. And then I was just thinking of some examples of this. Someone has described some of these beliefs as luxury beliefs. For example, no-fault divorce is a belief that you can have the luxury to hold if you're wealthy, because you can get divorced and you can still have two homes, no problem. Or the same thing is true of like, in my view, defund the police. It's easy to say that if you live in a very secure neighborhood where there aren't drug deals going down and weapons being carried about, but it's very difficult if you live in an inner city to find that a palatable belief. And so then we foist it upon the whole, though, and so forth. And here's another example: detransitioning. People who are detransitioning, that particular those people do not fit the theory. Do not fit gender theory and the construction of your own gender, social construction of your own gender. You can transition to another gender, but you can't go back. That just does not fit their theory. So David is getting into this, but it's not where he starts. He's really starting in the book with these important high-level ideas that really become the point of view that either open up or restrict what you can see as reality. So could you do this? And by the way, just a prompt to those of you. I see we have 2 questions now, and in a few minutes we're going to move to those questions. So if you've got a question, good time to maybe put it in the Q&A box. But could you describe it's your last myth? It's the myth of the imagined self, and you've said this is kind of where we've evolved historically. Take 3 or 4 minutes and describe for us the myth of the imagined self. What it says about reality, and what you see. Why is it even attractive to people?
Yeah, well,
There's something quite wrong. What is the myth of the imagined self?
Well, the myth of the imagined self, of course, like all myths, it is made up of several elements. One is that there is no God. There are no absolutes. There's no standard to which I have to adjust my vision of reality to. That reality is actually a product of my own consciousness, of what I'm doing. In a large sense, the imagined self comes out of Descartes. I talk a lot about Descartes' cogito, right? I think, therefore I am. And the philosophers have argued for centuries what he meant by that, but the common understanding of it, what it seems to mean to any average person is, my being is a result of my thinking. I created myself by thinking of myself. I think, therefore I am. Now, never mind that logically it's circular reason. If you say I think, you're already assuming being, I, right? Therefore I am, so that's just a nonsense statement. But we have so bought into the Cartesian idea that it's our thinking that is responsible for who we are. It's not God. I mean, the Christian statement is, God is, therefore I am. Without God, I would not be around, right? God created me, and therefore that's where everything starts. God is, and that's the beauty of the primordial myth. In the beginning, God, right? You can't get started without that. And as even Nietzsche himself said, who denied absolutes, he said, God is dead, therefore there are no absolutes, because in order to have absolutes, you have to have God. So the imagined self begins with this idea that there are no absolutes. I can be whatever I want to be. And I'm not limited by really anything other than those kind of physical limitations, those other limitations, which with the help of science, technology, education, blah, 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 all those things can be overcome. So there's a huge emphasis on all those other things that will help me overcome it. The other aspect of the imagined self is, I'm not, whatever happens, I'm really not to blame, because it's all these other things that are forcing or constraining me in some way, that I need a better education, I need more money, I need a face I need a face job, I need to change my sex, I need all these other things in order to achieve what I am meant to be, what I want to be, because that is, by the way, where meaning and purpose comes in. There's no meaning and purpose to life that's given to us. We have the whole meaning of life is what we ascribe to ourselves. The whole purpose of life is whatever purpose we adopt for ourselves. So the myth of the imagined self is a hugely contemporary, popular idea now. I mean, even I go back to the court, Justice Kennedy's statement about, we need to be free to define the universe for ourselves and define ourselves for ourselves. And I mean, I can't quote it exactly, but it's the broadest, most breathtakingly ambitious statement you can imagine. And it's hard to believe that anybody in their right mind would even think that is all up to the individual. The universe can be thinking anything I want it to be. So I read the book. You get a lot more of the imagined self, but that's where I would start it.
Yeah. Well, then one more question for you, Dave, before we go to the audience. I'd like to zoom up at 30,000 feet. And this might be challenging to do, but it's to me what makes the book so interesting. It's this juxtaposition of the three sacred myths and these three secular, and particularly how there's a historical progression that seems to be present in the way you present these myths. Some of our readers, if they were looking at your book, they would be looking at the table of contents and seeing those. But could you give like a description of the first three and what that does for the reader to establish kind of a mythical reality, and then the next three? If you had to kind of do that in a high level way, that structure, how would you summarize it? That's kind of the mile markers on the journey.
Yeah, that's you're asking me to build a wall without stones. I mean, come on now. There's a few ways of handling this. One thing is, of course, the first three, the truths are revealed. Okay, they're just revealed truths. They're just given to us. In the second three, we believe that our life experiences, our experiments, our thinking has discovered those truths. And that's, I think, maybe the meta myth that you could hold the whole book in. And yet I hope people who read the book will realize what nonsense that is. That in fact all these truths, all the stones in the field are out in the field. They're not things we invent.
If I could just tag onto that, because you're prompting something. Yeah, you've got revelation, which of course we know as Christians comes to us in at least two ways. There is what's revealed in Scripture and what's revealed in the book of nature. And, like Psalm 19 says, that language that comes to us from the book of nature cannot be missed. It goes forth to every person, and we hear it and we know it. Paul picks up on this in Romans 1. We know something about the divine nature and eternal power of God from what has been made. And I would say, and I know you believe this, you've already said it in so many ways, but what comes to us in those three sacred myths as well is music. We perceive beauty and harmony. It's mysterious and it's complicated, but we hear that music and we're drawn to it. And we know that our meaning is involved. We were meant to be placed in the garden. We it's beautiful. There's cosmic order, beauty all around us, and it's singing. If we just had the ears to keep hearing it and kind of start singing along with it, you might say. When you get to the secular myths, it's discord. It reflects a person who said, I'm no longer going to listen to that song or follow that melody. I'm going to do this on my own. And I am going to be myself, the cosmic creator of meaning. And of course, that's just contrary to what's given. So when it's contrary to what is actually real, which is the existence of God, the existence of truth and beauty and goodness that we all know and perceive intuitively, you can't even argue for it. Like, how do you argue against truth or logic or beauty? You have to use these things even to try to refute them. They're just given. They're like, the analogy that comes to my mind is like the points of direction on a compass. Can you imagine somebody saying, I don't like the imposition of the compass. I don't like north, south, east, or west. Why should I have to be conformed to any one of those directions? I am adirectional. Well, sorry, you don't have that choice. It's been given to you to be facing one direction or another. And so it seems to be a rejection of the given and then the inevitable discord that comes to the human. And then you just trace that out. Does that sound right to you? And would you add anything to it?
Well, we've talked about that, and actually we talk about it a bit in the book. But you're absolutely right. Of course, the only thing I'd say is, but even in God's terms, you're free to ignore the compass. But there are consequences to ignoring the compass. I mean, Cain is perfectly free to tell God, get lost, I don't want you in my life, and move on. And by the way, as I point out in the book, we have this sort of naive notion that, well, the God's not going to like that. He's going to smite him down for that. No. He, for all we know, Cain goes on to live a fairly happy, prosperous life. He's the founder of cities. He has apparently multiple marriages. He does quite well. Thank you very much. And that will be people. I mean, that is our reality. I mean, I know lots of people who seem happy and they have families and they're doing perfectly well, and God doesn't have any place in their lives. I mean, he's not needed. So there aren't easy, but I think you're touching on something, David, Chris, I'll put in a pitch for Chris. If anyone out there is thinking of writing a book, you should really write it with him, because he will ask you the questions you need to answer in your book. But there are a lot of things missing in the secular myths. A lot of things. You mentioned beauty. It's gone, and beauty is. I mean, our myth is Christian. It's a love story. I mean, it is just a love story from the beginning to the end, I make a big point of that at the end of the book, of why it's a love story, why I'm not reading that into it, why it really is right from the beginning. When God, creates, who is this God who creates? Well, St. John says at the very end, this God is love. He creates out of love. He sends his son out of love. He dies out of love. I mean, all of this is generated by love. And yet, where's the love in the science myth? Where's the love in the reason myth? I mean, a world without love is hell. And I quote, of course, a number of Russian philosophers on that subject. But I mean, it's just, if you stand back from it, which I know you're trying to do here, and look at it for what it is, it's mind-boggling that we can get sucked into something that doesn't have those elements which are so fundamentally important to us, like beauty, love, truth, the only things you can build a life around, a marriage around, a family around. Anyway, so.
Thank you, David. I hope that those of you who are viewing right now, maybe watching the recording, are leaning in. You will find just a lot more specific things addressed by David, going through these 6 myths in the Stones Cry Out. So we want to go to your questions now. So let's do that, and I'll proceed fairly much, for the most part, in order. And this is from Micah. You mentioned the myth of science. Has this myth come about through a kind of intellectual dishonesty or disingenuousness, fooling ourselves that science has no metaphysical or mythic qualities, when all along it embodies one of the most powerful ways of viewing the world and reality?
Well,
How do you respond?
bear in mind that a lot of the most significant scientists had profound faith. You know, the discoverer of the primeval atom was a Belgian monk, Isaac Newton. He didn't write just science books. He wrote very evangelical tracts. I mean, these are men, and I've said in the book, you can be a scientist, and what you can see in what God has done in nature is beauty. I mean, and so, you know, right now, those scientists really don't have the microphone because we're living in a very atheistic, godless culture and time. And, you know, I know from just trying to get a book published in this culture, it's very hard to get a book published where you take a strong Christian contra-cultural point of view. I mean, you have to go to a Christian publisher to do that. You know, Doubleday is not going to publish your book. So that is the way. But in terms of science, I mean, there's always a problem in writing a book like this, where you're taking a strong point of view that suddenly someone's going to come, wait, science isn't that bad, or social science is not that bad, or this is not that bad. No, these things aren't all bad, but there needs to be some balance now. Someone has to point out where the serious flaws are. And in terms of science, remember, science started in the ancient world with the profound appreciation for what the natural world was. I mean, so much so the excess at that time was they worshiped nature. You know, they worshiped these things when that was regarded as by men and women of faith, that was the problem, worshiping nature. Now, you know, our view of nature is something to deconstruct and to manipulate to our own benefit. And then we come back, by the way, to the whole question of the imagined self. I mean, if I were a scientist, a real believing science person right now, what would upset me would be the extent to which science has become instrumental. You know, science is only important as it helps me personally. You know, either get over a disease, change my gender, have you know, improve my computer. Science means nothing to me. I'm not in awe of nature. I just want to know how I can use it to increase my income, to increase my comfort, to increase my sense of well-being. So, and that's, if you think about it again, in terms of how everything is connected, that is what science is going to be to a person without faith, because there's no other thing for it to be. I mean, it exists as an instrument for my personal benefit. Anyway, no, I'm absolutely not against science. What I am against is this whole notion we talked earlier about, the scientific view that many scientists have, that that's all there is, that somehow, you know, the mind equals the brain. Nonsense. The mind does not equal the brain. The brain is important, but the mind is much more than the brain. And or scientists view that, you know, we talked about, the book goes into the determinism of science, you know, that I don't know what I'm ordering for breakfast tomorrow morning, but science can tell me. Well, forget it. I mean, that just like, forget it. But we have to believe these things, you know, to be thoroughgoing, because science does control, you know, our animal nature. I mean, we can make predictions about nature, but we can't make predictions about us, because we're not wholly nature. We're also partly that image of God.
Yeah. Thank you. There's so much there, of course, that we could delve into, like even some of the developments in biology and microbiology, where the evolution from non-organic matter to organic matter is a mystery that it's apparently not able to be solved, and some even secular scientists are realizing this. You cannot create a paramecium in the lab, no matter how hard you try. And this is leading people to begin to posit once again that there must be a divine reality. There must be mind outside of matter. But we won't go there, but that's happening. That's another issue. I'll go to Joy now. Joy asked a question about architecture. She says, could you please speak a little bit more about the damage to architecture and where to go to think more about that topic?
Well, well, she's sending me a fastball right down the middle of the plate. Because where I would go with it is to Vitruvius. Vitruvius is the only architect from the ancient world we have. He was from the 1st century, Augustan Rome's architect. He was the inspiration for all those Renaissance architects like Palladio, Alberti, you know. Oh, my dog just barked. Anyway, but where, and I have a big bias in terms of classical architecture, but I don't want that bias to get in the way of my answer. My answer is that architecture should be of a human scale about beauty. That's what architecture should be. And when I mean of a human scale, when we go back to the Garden City ideas that destroyed so many American cities, the architect should have started living in those communities and finding out how people relate to one another. What is it that makes them safe? What is it that makes them communities? What is it that makes the people in them happy? What is it that makes that community work? Instead of start with a theoretical idea about, hey, we can put all these people into a smaller space and then plant pretty gardens around them and they'll be much happier. Well, I'm sorry, that didn't happen. That created projects in which all these pretty spaces around, no one goes into them because that's where the crime is. No one knows who their neighbor is because they're living vertically. I mean, all these, Jane Jacobs, I mean, her books are, Bible to me. I mean, they're brilliant. But the point is that architecture ought to begin with a real love for what is beautiful and what is human in scale. And the reason I started with Vitruvius is because, you're all, I'm sure, familiar with Leonardo's painting of the man in the circle. Mm-hmm. That painting is called Vitruvian Man because Vitruvius said every dimension in a space where humans inhabit that space ought to be a factor of 6. And if you make it a factor of 6, humans will be much happier, more at home, more suited to that space than they will be if you make it by some other factor. Well, I don't know about your life experience, but my life, there are very few spaces that are done that way. But the spaces that are done that way that I've walked into, it's like, wow, this is how it's supposed to be. Why have we left this idea behind? And so you walk in these spaces where they're just monumental. Some architect is celebrating himself, like Mr. Whitman. And it's like, I'm not interested in celebrating you. I want you to make a space for me as a human being. But now remember too, we're living, we don't even talk about living in a humanistic age. We're living in a post-humanistic age. So we've even left this idea behind in a philosophical sense, in a mythic sense. And one of my best friends is an architect. His name is Fernando Gonzalez. He's retired, so you can't hire him, but he and I are building a school in Portugal right now. And we took over a very ultra-modern shopping center in Sintra, which was going out of business. And it was ultra-modern. It's very modern, recent shopping center, probably going out of business, both because shopping centers are becoming dinosaurs, and also because it was ultra-modern. And it was not a place you wanted to spend a lot of time as a human being. Well, we're having to reconvert the whole thing to a human scale building as a school for young people. And Fernando is one of the last of the classical architects. But if I were to show you a picture of this school, it is breathtaking. And yet, and I'd ask you this, you show me one American school that looks this beautiful and is designed in this way, and I'll eat my hat. We don't design like that anymore. We build schools basically look like prisons, most of them. I mean, they're flat roofed, rectangular windows, pavement all around them. They're hideous. And yet we are we allow architects to come in and impose that kind of thing on our children. When I can walk through a Greek, of all my life, I've walked through Greek villages. I've taken pictures of the schools in these Greek villages that were built in the 19th and early 20th century. They're beautiful. Big, big windows, classical shapes, columns. I mean, just where you want your children to go to school, as opposed to the school down the street. So.
Yeah, I mean, you can, who asked that question? She obviously touched a nerve. Joy, yeah, thank you for that.
Fortunately, I'm
David,
full of nerves.
yeah, well, but yeah, because as we've said earlier, everything is connected. And when you think about beauty and the garden myth that's full of beauty, it leads to what we do in the garden, what we build, what we create, how we imitate the creator. And so architecture is a reflection of that, and it reflects culture, just like all art does. So it's a legitimate space for reflection. And it is a problem because the architecture signals to everybody what's supposed to be happening or what is happening. It puts you in a particular disposition, and a factory or a prison.
Keep talking. I'm gonna get some.
Yeah. And so if you, I just happen to know that that's something that David has really been concerned about. And even the room that he's in, that library was built with a lot of thought about what's gone before and what would be beautiful and what's kind of perennial and human in every age. So there's always variety on a theme, but some books. Jane Jacobs' book, Life and Death of the Great American City, I think is the title, is the book that one of the books he was referring to about urban planning gone awry. Jane Jacobs is very interesting. Another book, if you're interested in architecture, for schools, is Making School Beautiful by John Skillen, who's also studied architecture a lot, lived in Italy half his life, and has thought about classical Christian education in schools. Another great book is Christopher Alexander's book, Timeless Way of Building. That also just touches on the principles of beauty and architecture that are timeless. It's a remarkable book if you have that interest. Okay, moving on to another question. This is Crystal, and she says, David, do you still want to address the architectural question, or is that okay if we move on?
I couldn't find the book, but you mentioned The Timeless Way of Building, and that's another great book, Christopher's.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, it's amazing. So, well then, we'd all like to be in your library looking for books, but we'll return to the next question, which is Crystal. She says, what are your recommendations for how to engage those in our social and familial circles to raise their awareness of their secular mythos? How would those recommendations change for advising our children? Ours are in the late teens, she says, as they enter an increasingly deceptive culture. How to engage those in social and familiar structures? And this relates as well to a question from Karia. She says, you make a comment of revealed knowledge. How does one engage in a conversation with someone who denies the truth of revealed knowledge and only believes that knowledge comes through reason or experience? So maybe you could combine those two questions in your answer.
Oh, wow. Well, for one thing, I think if you look at most, and I talk about this in the book a bit, I describe them as prescriptive, usually they're interdicts or rules, prescriptive rules and descriptive rules. And society is normed on the basis of either prescriptive rules or descriptive or both. And what I would simply argue is that, and a prescriptive rule is basically a revealed rule, right? A descriptive rule is a rule that we've come to through experimentation or some other method. And what I would say is that we have lived with prescriptive rules for thousands of years. And the reality is that those revealed rules have overwhelmingly proven to be wise. And when we've departed from them, we've gotten ourselves into trouble. Now, we can point at some of those prescriptive rules and say, well, what is the first prescriptive rule? That's a quiz question. Answer, don't eat that knowledge of good and evil over there. Don't pick of that fruit. That is the first prescriptive rule. Now, what could be more arbitrary than that? Here's the garden, all these beautiful things, this most beautiful tree in the middle of the garden. And by the way, we shouldn't call it an apple because that's not scriptural. It was never called an apple in the Bible, right? We call it an apple because we're bloody materialists. And so we've got to give it a material substance. But we're told, don't eat of that fruit. Well, it's the classic example of our reaction against a revealed truth. Wait, this fantastic thing right here, as it's described, it's beautiful to the eyes, it's delicious to the taste, I really want it. Wait, and I can't eat it? That sounds pretty arbitrary to me. I mean, that's just a bizarre rule. That is where this whole kind of thing starts unraveling. And the reality is, as I try to point out in the book, is, we're all great empiricists. We should, all things should be proven. Well, probably nothing has been proven more over time across cultures than the prescriptive rules that men and women have lived by for a long time. So, but we'll still challenge them because it's like that fruit in the middle of the garden. It's like, it's beautiful, it tastes delicious. Why wouldn't I want to do this? Yeah, I'll give you a real example. I'm married, right? Now, when I got married, I married a beautiful woman I had fallen in love with. Now, was she the last beautiful woman I ever saw in my life? Was she the last person I ever saw that I thought, oh, she is beautiful? Maybe I should have waited around and married her. The point is that fruit is always out there. And yet we know if we pick that fruit, which is prescriptive, remember the modern view is that this is a social construct. There are no absolutes. There are no rules. Society makes rules. They're social constructs. So I should be free. Or as Nietzsche said, we're living beyond good and evil. I should be free to pick that fruit and from that tree over there and this tree over here. Well, why not? But we know that if we do that, we destroy our lives, we destroy our marriages, we destroy ourselves. And so the point is that when you get into revealed or non-revealed, it's kind of a misnomer to say the revealed truths are the most well, they're not really arbitrary. They're the ones that haven't been proven. The fact is they have been proven, and it's these other rules that are constantly we're stumbling over. Look how we're struggling in order to create these descriptive rules, and we can't agree on what is good and what is bad. And over time, what we find out is, oh, that descriptive rule, that was probably not a very good idea. So
scientific law is always subject to revision.
Yeah,
right? And even the things that we declare laws. And so, in other words, mystery is present even in the law of gravity.
Yeah.
By calling it a law, sometimes we think, well, we've got to figure it out. We know this. Well, this inherent property we call the law of gravity still isn't explained. To call it a law, this begs an explanation. Why do masses attract? What is that mechanism is still not understood. And then there seem to be exceptions to it, back to Einstein and so on. And so this is what we find with scientific research is that they're still astonished. Think of string theory in physics and quantum physics, like they just the world is more mysterious. Yeah, we And this is what's happening at microbiological level. Darwin did not have an electron microscope. And now that we can look at everything in a cell, it's a city. A single cell is like a town. So it's very complicated. So I think you go there too, just by pointing out that it's not like you've got something easy over here and something kind of hard and arbitrary over here. You've got mystery throughout. And as David's pointing out, prescriptive rules often, and this is what Lewis does in the Tao, by the way, if you read the End of the Abolition of Man, there are just some universal moral principles that humans have.
You're freezing us, Chris.
These things are just. Oh,
yeah.
sorry about that. How about now? Okay, let's take one or two more. We were trying to finish up about now. I'll go to
Chris.
Still freezing?
Chris, let me, the first part of that question was never answered, and I wanted to give a very short answer to it that goes back to something we said previously. If you're interested in how to address these myths with your children or with your friends, I'm going to put in a pitch for the book, but I think one of the reasons I wrote the book is I wanted to help people who really care about this to understand, to sort of find their own answers to your question. Once you understand the nature of the myths we're talking about, you will have your own way of addressing these questions or issues with your friends and with your children. In fact, I hope you'll start seeing things happening in the news that you're reading or in what you're hearing from the pulpit or whatever that will relate to this. Like, oh, that's interesting. Or your children will come home from school with an idea and you'll be able to say, well, you know where that idea comes from? Or have you considered this problem with that idea? I mean, this is a book. I told Chris this when I first submitted my book to him. I said, this is a book I wish I had read when I was 18 years old, and I wish my children had read before I sent them off to university. Because it just arms them. It gives them an edge when it comes to dealing with the questions that are going to come flooding at them. Anyway, sorry, Chris,
Yeah, no, that's all right. Thank you for answering that second part of the question. It reminds me too that when I was first reading your book, I said, well, David, this reads like a book of apologetics. And from one perspective, it does. But David did not want this book to be purely a book of apologetics. But it has that kind of, it's addressing some of the common objections that come to us about the Christian faith and situating Christian faith right now in the 21st century, given what's happened over the last 2 or 3 centuries. But it's also part memoir. It's a story of David Hicks thinking about these things for quite a while, and then wanting to have a conversation, not just a handbook of Christian apologetics, but a conversation that helps one to understand where David Hicks is and why, and where we as a culture are and why. So I think it's a fascinating book that is kind of a blend of memoir, historical theology and mythology and Christian theology and apologetics. It's kind of multi-genre in that respect, but it does read a bit like a story. And that'll be a segue to this next question from Chris Stevens, who says, is science simply storytelling? Is the science of immediately observed phenomena a story looking for data, or data telling a story? Are we better storytellers than the scientists?
That's a well-worded question, because one of the great dangers of, and I come back to theoretical thinking, one of the great dangers of any of these myths, particularly the science myth, is that it tends to become a story looking for data rather than a story born out of data. And one of the things I do in the book is C.S. Lewis, when he was addressing the Oxford Club in the Socratic Club in Oxford in 1948, he told the science myth. He just told it. He said, here is one of the most amazing, brilliant, poetic stories ever told. And then he's told the science myth. And then he talked about why he had decided to become, why he disbelieved the science myth before he accepted the Christian myth. It's really interesting, his reasons. But the point I want to make here is that if you read that book, myth, the science myth he tells in 48, it hasn't changed a bit. Quantum theory has come into being, replacing Newtonian theory, but it's it's still the same myth. And what I've tried to do, as I said in the beginning of the book, I've tried to be fair about all of these myths. I've tried to let the proponents of these myths, whether it's Newton or Richard Dawkins or Lawrence Krauss or Bertrand Russell, I've tried to let them tell the story. This is what we believe. This is what we scientists believe. And or my favorite part of the whole book actually is a lecture that you can YouTube that was given by O'Neill. He's very popular. In 60 Minutes called him on New York on 60 Minutes. He was called the new Carl Sagan.
Oh, Bill Nye's?
No,
No.
he's a.
Oh, it's Nicholas. Yeah, it's Nick. I forget his name.
Anyway,
yeah, let's look him up.
Yeah, the whole lecture is there, and I want you to look at the whole lecture. It doesn't last long; it's maybe 5 minutes, but it is so full. It's a perfect telling of the modern science myth by a modern science messiah. This is the guy who completely believes the myth and wants everyone to believe it, and it's told very well.
Neil deGrasse.
Neil deGrasse, very attractive guy, very articulate, lays it all out there. And yet if you listen to the myth, and this is what I try to do, I play the whole myth, quote from the whole myth and say, no, wait a second, listen to what he's saying. None of it really makes any sense. It's not logical. It's not empirically evident or true. It violates almost every canon of reason and common sense. And yet he's laying it out there to a very appreciative audience. And I'm asking, what's going on here? What's going on is that he's holding a tent meeting with a bunch of fundamentalist science worshipers, and they're amening him all the way through his sermon. But the rest of us who are standing there saying, these people are crazy. They're looking for something to believe in just like everybody else. And it doesn't really matter that it makes no sense what he's saying. It's my favorite part of the whole book, actually. I had so much fun writing it because every time he opened his mouth, he was saying something that made no sense. If you looked at it from a more objective or dispassionate angle and weren't a true believer in science. So yeah, I don't know, but
this is great. I know we have to wrap up, but you can see how this way leads to way, and we have there's really interesting things to explore and talk about as we think about these three clashing myths of mythic reality. I couldn't help but to think about the recent conversation that I and Hershey Ali had with Richard Dawkins about 2 months ago now. I and Hershey Ali, a former New Atheist who has come to the faith, and was hanging around with Richard Dawkins for years, and they're friends. And they, at the beginning of this debate, you can find it on YouTube. It's a discussion, really, not a debate, where Dawkins and I and Hershey Ali talk about her conversion to Christianity. And it's this very thing that David's describing. Dawkins says, you can't be a Christian. prove to me that you're Christian. You're just doing this for personal comfort. You just don't really believe in a virgin birth, etc. And I understand Julie has truly come to faith, and she's a very smart woman. And she says to Richard Dawkins, I do choose to believe these things because only these things account for the best things we've ever enjoyed in Western civilization, including morality, ethics, civil discourse, kind of democracy we've come to enjoy. And she read Tom Holland's book Dominion, where he does something very similar. So there are a number of, I'll just put it this way, kind of well-known agnostics, academics, who are rethinking their positions because they're seeing the bankruptcy of those positions in terms of what of an ethical, moral, and civic life. So there's a number of doors in, to go back to the architecture metaphor, there's a number of doors in to the church. It could be your concern about moral discourse, civil discourse, a breakdown of democracy that leads you to say, well, what led us to what was so good in the past? That's what Tom Holland did. And he's rediscovering the Christian faith. Chesterton says that the Christian faith is discovered every generation, not as an old religion, but as a new religion.
Yeah.
And it's usually young people knocking on the door, which people thought was a coffin in which Christianity was being buried, because the founder of Christianity knows how to get out of the grave. That's how Chesterton puts it. So there's new things happening. There are people knocking at the door, and they're finding that they're becoming hungry again, whether they would express it this way or not, for the sacred myths, because they are real. They have proven themselves over time. And David's book is playing into this, I think, this cultural phenomenon of people beginning to knock on the door again, revisit. They're coming back, asking good questions. And so that's maybe one thing that you can do with your friends and associates who are outside of the church, and maybe some who have wandered who need to come back. David's book, I think, will help you to do that, either by reading it yourself and then having conversations, or in some cases, giving this book to those people. And I would just make one more plug as we're closing. That David, we went out to David's house there in Montana, and we recorded David and his wife just talking about their journey and talking about these matters. And you'll even see his dog Atticus occasionally appear in this video. I happen to be a dog lover, so I always notice the dogs. But it's on classicalu.com. There is a course featuring David talking about many of these things, and education in particular. If we had more time, it would be fun to just say, all right, everything that we've talked about so far, how does it relate to education in a K through 12 classical school? But I trust that many of you can already make those connections. Could be a very good book to read, with, say, 11th and 12th graders at a classical school, and I think very appropriate for college students. So I want to thank you for all of you on the call for giving your time. We really appreciate it. We have a recording of this, of course, for many who registered but who couldn't come. And David, as always, thank you to you for what you've done, not just today, but over the years, so that this book is a reality. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris, for giving me a chance. Thanks.
Oh, of course. All right. Goodbye, everyone. And God bless you.